We're living in a time of great disruption for the P&Ls of coffee roasters. Coffee prices keep going up, and many roasters are absorbing these price increases and frankly, stressing themselves and their businesses out. I'm Garrett Oden from Fresh Cup, and this is the Coffee Think Tank podcast, a show about emerging trends, ideas, and innovations in coffee. Today's guest is Luke Waite, the founder of Pomelo Coffee Consulting. Luke has spent years working operations and sales at some of Chicago's most respected specialty roasters like Metric Coffee and Passion House. Now through Pomelo, Luke helps roasters understand and improve their coffee, people, and financial operations. He also just wrote a book, The Owner's Manual, a guide to sustaining a coffee roaster, which is pretty good, and we'll talk about some. Today, we'll dig into the roaster profitability landscape and how it's changing, how wholesale dynamics are different when costs are all over the place, and becoming better coffee salespeople. If you are a leader in a roastery and feeling the pressure right now, and you want to run a company with healthy margins, this is a good one to listen to. Welcome to the Coffee Think Tank. The most innovative coffee businesses I know give themselves the space and energy to nurture a culture of innovation. Unfortunately, space and energy are things that most coffee business owners are short on. That's why I'm excited to introduce you to this season's sponsor, SumUp. SumUp is a point-of-sale company with a powerful suite of tools designed to help coffee businesses master the day-to-day and optimize customer retention so that you can have the flexibility and confidence to explore new opportunities. A full digital POS system, mobile card readers, loyalty and marketing automation, and even self-serve kiosks. Whether you're running a small cafe or a growing roastery, SumUp's tools give you the breathing room to explore innovation in your business. Visit sumup.com to learn more. Luke, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invite, and thanks for having an awesome podcast. Better than mine, I've heard. Rumors.
No, yours is great. I love it, and it was fun to be on it earlier this year. And glad to have you on and return the favor, and also ask you all the questions that I didn't have time to ask you then. So yeah, if you're listening, you should go check out that interview. It was really fun. Well, Luke, you have such a fascinating history. You've done a lot of sales and operations roles in different roasters. There's one thing that I know that was a part of your history with one of your first jobs. Your goal was to be the first Michelin-Starred roaster. This is such an interesting concept. I've never heard anybody else talk about this. Can you tell me, what was how did that goal take shape? What were you doing in the company to make yourself the first Michelin-Starred roaster?
Oh yeah, it's very interesting because when I started working there, I didn't even know what the Michelin Guide was. I'd never eaten at a Michelin-Starred restaurant. And so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And that wasn't also an articulated or stated goal until a few months into working there. And then what ended up happening was there was a general manager who, we had a couple locations, and the general manager sort of reset the team at all of the locations and clarified that our new goal was to become the first Michelin-Starred. His language was cafe. He really cared about service and guest interaction. That was the declared purpose. And we were a roaster as well, so I suppose it would be combined. And the approach was, he had worked, his name's Duwand, he had worked in some Michelin-Starred restaurants around Chicago, and the assistant general manager also had worked in a couple of Michelin-Starred cocktail bars around Chicago and some restaurants in their cocktail programs that were Michelin-Starred. And we were figuring it out because there wasn't really a map for how do we get there. And transparently, we didn't get there because the company grew really, really quickly, and we got acquired before we were able to even try to get a star. But that was the stated intention. We were growing really fast, and we recognized that there's an opportunity here. You know, what's the difference between the cafe up the street and the cafe the other direction up the street? And we wanted to create an environment where folks came in and every single thing was, one, made in-house, and two, was intentional and thought through from the very moment they stepped through the door till before till they left. And so that was sort of the thinking and the thought process was, how do we create an experience and an environment that doesn't feel like a cafe and feels like they're getting way more for their money because of how amazing the experience was. So that was a stated goal, and that was sort of the direction. And we ended up, it was a really wild place. The unit that we worked in was sort of the flagship, and it was actually the smallest location. It was maybe 600 square feet, and we had some storage downstairs in the basement, but the whole cafe was just really, really tight. And we had every single step in the process of when somebody ordered a drink, every single step had cups got placed in a specific spot. We had language and shorthand for how we talked about guests, or how we talked about the syrups that were in the drink, or, if somebody had a special request, everything had a shorthand, and we had communication around it. We used kitchen calls. And so it was just a really elevated space to work in. And the last thing I'll say is our standards around training and around cleanliness I've never worked in another cafe or roaster that had that high of standards around how we trained our people and how we handled guests and kept things clean. Besides spaces, I took everything, and whenever I help roasters, I try to implement those things. But it is difficult, right? Because most folks think of a cafe as sort of a chill job, and when you try to implement those types of standards, it's a different type of working environment, different type of job.
The Michelin Guide came to Texas this year for the first time, and there's a barbecue place that's just down the street from where I live that got a star. And I have never been, and now I'm thinking, blast, I should have gone, and now I'm going to pay 50% more based on how the menu looks now. Even the food hasn't changed, but they've had that validation. So it'd be really interesting to see what prices a Michelin-Starred cafe could command, once they've earned that. Well, what about now? What about in 2026? If somebody's like, all right, this is me, I hear this is my goal. We're going to be the first Michelin-Starred cafe. Are they going to have linens on the table? Is their espresso shot going to be, something wildly different? What does that look like now?
It's a good question. To be honest with you, I think that I might get in trouble for this, but I think that the Michelin Guide has changed quite a bit, and it's turned into more of a PR thing than an excellence thing in some ways. And so I think it is in some ways a pay to play, but in terms of the standards that you might have to implement, I don't know that it's necessarily linen. And I think that you see this in some of the restaurants that are getting stars, maybe not 3 stars, but 1 or 2 star restaurants. They're sometimes pretty casual environments. And I think that the way that they are judging restaurants has shifted pretty dramatically. And so, and to be honest, I don't know how they would even judge a cafe versus a restaurant, but I do think everything would need to be made in-house. I think that's sort of the table stakes. And I'm not just saying, like, obviously your coffee and your syrups. I'm saying you probably have to have all of your baked goods, any sandwiches or anything like that you're serving would need to be fully made in-house and not outsourced. I think it also goes down to how you're sourcing your raw products, your milk. Where are you getting that from? And, is it from Costco, or is it from a dairy farm that's doing a really, really thoughtful job, and maybe they're a regenerative farm or something of that nature. So I think it also goes back to your sourcing, how you're sourcing those products. And again, I will go back to what I said initially around, for us, it really came down to training. And I think that that's how you could really potentially receive a star, is having really thorough training and education around not just here's how to pull a shot of espresso, but here's how we recognize a first-time guest. And here's how we communicate that guest spilled their drink, and we need to get out and one, clean it up, two, give them a fresh drink, and three, maybe give them a drink coin or something. Those are the types of things that really start to separate you from just, well, the coffee was good, you sourced the products pretty well. It goes into training. How are we thinking about interacting with our guests, interacting with our space? And this is not going to blow anyone's mind, but anticipation. When somebody walks in and they're stumbling around and looking at the ceiling and looking at the merch, that's a first-time customer. That's not somebody who's been there before. And those are little things that you can train people to recognize and to seize that opportunity of, hey, welcome. Here's the menu. Do you need a treat? Do you want something hot? Something cold? And guiding those interactions from being able to recognize what's happening in front of you. I think that's where I would start, I think.
Yeah. And if somebody comes in, they're like, man, I didn't get my Chicago deep dish pizza. You go out there, you get a slice of Chicago deep dish pizza, you pour a shot of espresso on it, you cut it in this beautiful square, and you serve it to them, and you say, I heard you, I wanted to delight you.
Exactly.
That's probably part of the process somewhere.
Yeah.
You've read Unreasonable Hospitality, I'm sure.
That's on page 4 of our training manual.
Well, let's get into what I really want to ask you about, because there's few people that I think are really well equipped to answer this question. And it's such an important one for right now. And we're hearing from roasters all over the country. They are eating costs like crazy. Their margins are less secure than they've ever been. And it's just a rough time to be looking at the P&L and thinking about what a healthy business looks like. Can you tell us what's the state of roaster profitability going into 2026?
Eroding. Most of the folks that I'm talking to, last year was not particularly easy necessarily, but this year it's just a little less profit a little less meat on the bone. And so, yeah, you're just having to navigate, and hopefully you had healthy margins last year and the year before that, and you can kind of coast into this year without having to make too dramatic of price increases. But yeah, there is a real erosion of margin, and what people are willing to pay is just slowly starting to catch up with what roasters need to make. And so that's kind of where the state of things are at as it relates to profit and margin as we enter 2026.
Let's say I'm a roaster and, I look at the balance sheet, I'm not too happy. How do I know if am I in deep trouble, or, do I need to make some modest adjustments? I guess, what are you looking for to determine, how urgently somebody needs to reevaluate their pricing and their process and such?
It does depend on a few things. Depends on your roaster, depends on what your expectations are, it depends on your financial structure and your cash reserves, of course. But if you're below 10% net, it's time to make some pretty significant changes, because green coffee is not getting any cheaper from what I can see and from what I can tell, looking at the C market and looking at what specialty green is costing folks right now. It's not getting any cheaper. So if you're below 10% net as a roastery, I'm getting pretty nervous, and it's probably time to reevaluate your pricing, your wholesale structure, and how you're caring for clients too, and how you're communicating, hey, this is what's happening in the industry, and this is what we have to do to stay alive so that we can keep selling you coffee.
So you run a consulting firm called Pomelo, and you primarily work with roasters to people, process, profit. Those are kind of like your three pillars. Can you tell me, what does that look like? What kinds of things are you seeing now? And I'd love to hear a little bit about what that, what kinds of things you're up to.
Yeah, of course. So those are the three things I focus on. It's people, process, and profit. And I have a framework that I use. It's called the Core 7. And within the Core 7, those three things sit, so they sort of merge some of the cores together. So when we synthesize the Core 7 into what are we actually working on, it's your people, your process, and your profit. And then how does that play out? Well, with your people, one of the things that I see often is roasters start because or owners start a roastery because they like coffee, or maybe got into it because they were, it was a hobby and then it turned into a business. And then pretty soon you have a couple employees, and then you have 10, and then you have 50 employees. And then pretty soon you're not a coffee roaster anymore. You're a people manager. And so a lot of the work that I do is around culture and around developing leaders and around org structure, and developing org structure for folks that, maybe have been around for a while and realize, it's time for us I don't want to be working in the business every single day. And I need to have a second in command or an ops person who's overseeing the roasting department and the production department and, our tech side of the house. And so that's what we help folks with on the people side, is how do we structure our organization, and how do we develop individuals, and then how do you as an owner lead them? Because that's another key thing that I work with owners on, is how do we actually lead and develop our team? Because a lot of them have come from places where maybe they've led teams of 5 or 10 people, but then they've got 80 employees running around, and it's time to become a leader of people and a developer and cast vision. So that's the first one. The second one is process related. And this is honestly the most simple one. It's related to very similar sort of outcome. Is you start a roaster, maybe you have a couple wholesale accounts, and they're texting you, hey, I need 5 pounds of coffee. Hey, I need 20 pounds of coffee. And then you have 30 wholesale accounts. And now you're getting blown up on Monday at 9:45 a.m. because your wholesale accounts are out of coffee, and they're texting you their orders, and they're saying, when's it going to be? And then you're sort of running around trying to fill orders. So that's when the process comes into play, is how do we develop a process that's scalable to get you to where you want to be in the next, 5-10 years? And how do we make sure that you're not manually inputting orders or manually recording, Joe's Beans ordered, 10 pounds, and I got to write an invoice for them. So those are some of the process things we help with, is how do we build the internal workings sort of behind the curtain to scale. And then the last one around profit is really structured around pricing. And I believe in P&L integrated pricing, meaning for every pound of coffee that you sell, it has to be covered by, it has to carry its own weight on your P&L. And so we need to make sure that how much we're spending as a business is fully covered by what we're charging per pound. And that's where the profit comes into play, is how do we either increase your profit or get to profit or maximize an area of profit by either adding ancillary products that are maybe loss leaders, but that can allow you to increase your total sales and increase your profit. So those are some of the ways that we work with folks as it relates to the profit side of those 3 Ps: people, process, and profit.
The profit one is particularly tricky right now. We have this program, Roaster Link, where we match roasters with wholesale buyers. And we've heard some wild stuff. Roasters sometimes, are leaving the program and saying, we cannot make enough profit on the wholesale because there is such a resistance from the cafes we serve, the restaurants, to raising prices that, we've tried to raise prices and, they're leaving us for Webstront, or some other roaster,
Sure.
who's got like a really wildly cheaper coffee. And we're just hearing some wild stuff about the struggles people are having. We just did a survey, and probably when this episode comes out, we'll release some more of the data from this, but from roasters in that program, a lot of them, about 80% of them said we're eating a huge amount of the cost that we are, that's a new cost for us from the last year or two from the rising cost of coffee. And, some of them have raised prices a couple times, but not nearly enough for what they should have. And they all know that. And it seems like people are, we only had one roaster say we are very carefully protecting our margin. Everyone else says we're kind of killing ourselves trying to not scare our accounts away. And it seems like we're in this place where, everybody's worried about being the first one to stick their head out. And,
Yeah.
are we all just like, is this like a downward spiral for everybody? If that's the case and we're all like afraid to do what we need to do? I don't know. What's your take on that?
Well, it's interesting. I'm curious what the sample size is, if you don't mind sharing how many folks filled out that survey.
So the people who filled out the survey is pretty lengthy. It's only 15 folks, but we have 75 roasters in the program, and we
Sure.
talk to 3 or 4 each week who will indicate this to us as well.
So 1 in 15 roasters is in a healthy financial position, which to me is terrifying, right? And obviously this is a small sample size, but it's important for us to understand as an industry what those numbers illustrate. 1 in 15. I mean, let's just say it was 10. That's 1 in 10. That's 10% of all roasters are, healthy from a financial position. And it's even less than that in actuality from your survey. So the thing that freaks me out about that is because it's like you can't eat all of those costs. The costs are going to continue to go up, and pretty soon, speaking to a Western or American audience, you're going to have tariffs that you cannot plan for. So if you think that you're just somehow going to be able to float increased costs across the board for your packaging and for your labels and for the cost of living is going up, so your labor is going up and grain price is going up. It's just there's some point where you can't eat it. You have to say, I either don't have a business or I make money. And I understand that that's a tough thing to say, but I'm speaking from experience. I'm speaking from a place of I've done that, where I've had multiple businesses where I said, this doesn't make money. I have to close the doors. I either need to increase what I'm charging my customers for what I'm providing to them, or if the market won't bear that, then maybe I need to close the doors. And my point in what I'm saying is not to be like, you should close. I want roasters to be healthy, stable, and profitable. That's my desire in all of the work that I do, is I want you to be healthy, stable, and profitable so that you can do the things you want to do. And if you're just continually eating costs, you're not going to be healthy, stable, and profitable. And so I think the runway for folks to be able to continue to eat those costs is we're coming to the end of it.
It seems like it. Yeah. What about tariffs? Tariffs in particular, a different kind of challenge than the market roller coaster. I'm curious, what should roasters be doing to outsmart the tariff troubles? What's the play here?
I mean, I'm always an advocate for forward buying, and I'm always like, contract your coffee out. You can lock in your pricing, be comfortable. And I'm always an advocate for, good business practices. What are the good business practices that we can put into place, structure our business so that we can be sustainable and healthy and profitable? Planning is one of those. Planning for the future. Saying, okay, I need to buy coffee at this dollar amount in order for me to make Y dollar amount. And so I'm going to go find coffees that are in that zone. And then also buying in larger quantities, because you're locking in probably better pricing, preferable pricing by buying in volume. But I will say this, the thing that I have seen roasters who have sort of made the best of this situation is you make friends with a lot of people. So green coffee is the thing that we're thinking about right now. Make friends with as many green providers as you can. It is not going to hurt you or them to start to build a relationship with as many green providers as you can, because then you can start to see, okay, who actually has quality that I'm happy with? What is their pricing? And where are they warehoused? Maybe there's a better provider than you've been using. And so that's really what I'm telling people right now is like, make friends with as many green providers as you can and leverage those relationships and use them wisely. But outside of that, I don't know. There's not a secret sauce to the tariffs.
Make good friends though. This is good advice. We talked to another roaster last week, and they said that they had their 4 salespeople call every single one of their hundreds of accounts earlier this year and explain the situation and talk about why prices were going to go up quite a bit. And they said they lost 0 accounts because their people they have in those roles are very friendly. It's relationship forward. You know, they like are pretty actively involved in supporting their partners. And, you know, I don't know if that's still true. You know, did they end up losing some people? Maybe. But I mean, I think sound like it had been 2 or 3 months since that happened. And, you know, not a single account was lost because they were friends. And, you know, it was let's work together on this type situation rather than we're your vendor and your bill's going up type situation. So I think making friends is better advice than like the strategy books would have you believe. Maybe.
Yeah. I have gone through multiple price increases and multiple roasters. I've coached other clients on going through price increases, and almost every single time, it's not every time, but almost every time, 0 pushback. And the folks that do push back, they are not aligned with what you're doing anyway. And they're probably getting preferential pricing from when you started your roaster, and you're paying to sell them coffee. And so just an encouragement to roasters is that rip the Band-Aid off. If you need to make, you know, if you've decided you want to have X% profit on wholesale coffee, that's the decision you need to make. And I hope that folks hear that, is that when you do price increases and when you do it thoughtfully by communicating, hey, this is what's happening, this is why, this is what it's going to do to your pricing, and here's what we would recommend to increase your own pricing, and here's how we're going to support you in this. That's how you should raise your prices, and don't feel like you have to just float the increases, because you can't.
Is the advice here any different for the larger, you know, medium to large roasters who they've been around for 15 years? They're roasting 500,000 pounds annually. You know, is their approach for them different? Should they be thinking about different things?
No, it's very similar. But I do think that how we care for, as an industry, I think we do a little bit better job of nurturing our wholesale accounts. And so I think that the conversation is in tandem with, you know, for the folks that have a couple of, maybe a head of sales and then 1 or 2 AMs, account managers. The thing that I would say to them is mobilize your account managers and your salespeople to nurture your existing accounts. Give them an opportunity, give your wholesale accounts an opportunity to recognize the value that you provide beyond a vendor of coffee. If you can do that, the conversation shifts a little bit. And for smaller roasters, that's a little tougher because it's probably the owner out there doing sales. And so for the larger companies that have a couple of salespeople, that's the advice that I would give to them, is think about nurturing, because we all know the phrase, it's easier takes less effort and less money to keep an account than to get a new one. And so maximize your existing accounts, let them know that you're going to support them, give them the structure, and let them see the value that you provide beyond just, I'm a vendor of coffee. Because they can go find another vendor of coffee anywhere, but they can't find your roaster that sources coffee the way you source coffee, that cares about them as a partner in the same way.
Speaking of nurturing existing customers, this is something I think is really interesting. Before I took over Fresh Cup a few years ago, I worked in content marketing for a bunch of food technology companies. And some of them are, you know, software as a service for like huge restaurant groups. And their approach to this was, you know, 2 to 3 months before their license would renew, they would go to those people and they would send them a gift And then down the road, they would try to call them, talk to them, and ask like, what's going on? What things are you working on? And even if they said something that was completely unrelated to that software, that person was tasked with going and helping them solve a problem. So it could be like,
Yeah.
let me introduce you to somebody else who I know has tackled this. Let me introduce you to like, a partner maybe who can, maybe support you in this way, or like they sent them a book. There's like a huge number of things you could do, but that was like part of the process was we'll send you a gift, we'll touch base with you, and some way or another, I'm going to help you. And, and then 6 weeks later, when it's time to have this conversation about, are you going to keep using our software, pay this huge amount of money to do this?
Right.
We've been there for them, and they're, this relationship is like, we've kind of reestablished this, we've re-cemented that. So I think about that a lot in terms of there's so much we can do to support our partners beyond just the immediate things that we do. And we see this like in Roaster, like a lot of the buyers, people starting a cafe, they want somebody who is going to be, a friend and an ally. They do not want a vendor. And the expectations
Absolutely.
that these food service companies have now for the roaster is frankly a lot higher than it used to be. And so roasters we see being successful are those who like are generous with sharing resources, who, are very friendly. Friendliness is like hard to, hard to measure, but seems to be an indicator of success in the program. So I think, friendliness is a big part of it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of this intangible stuff of supporting your partners, and even if it's things that are like not immediately relevant to what you offer, that's that can go a long way.
100%.
Okay, you've written this book, and it's about to come out. I got to read it early this year, and I loved it. I had not read a book like this about roasting. I don't know if there's anything else that's like quite like this for roasters out there. Why don't you give us a little teaser for what the book's called, what it's about? You've been doing this for like a while, so maybe give us a sense for what the process has been like.
Oh, goodness. Well, let's see. Let's start with the timeline for it. It was about 2.5 years all in from the moment I started writing the book to the moment I hit send to the printer and the binder. And so, yeah, it was a very long process. It's the longest project I've worked on outside of my own education. And the writing itself only took about 18 months. So that was honestly the easiest and sort of the fastest part of the whole process. Everything else took a lot longer, and I did it the hard way of I sourced all the products. I found a printer and a binder. I didn't go through a publisher, and I'm self distributing and selling it all through my website. And then I'm open to doing wholesale accounts. I'm starting to talk with folks that are going to be adding it to their cafes and their bookstores. But that's sort of the timeline and some of the process there. For the overall, like, what is this book? It's a book about how my framework that I use when I work with clients. And when I started consulting, I took a meeting with a man named Don Baker, and he's a consultant for CPG companies that you have in your pantry and in your refrigerator. And he was very generous with his time, and he asked me when we had a virtual meeting. He was like, tell me about your framework that you use when you work with clients. And I didn't have one, and I was just sort of stumbling over myself trying to figure out how to articulate how I help clients. And he was like, well, why don't I just show you what I use? And so he showed me his framework that he used. And the thesis from that conversation was, when you're working with folks on consulting, it's very intangible. And so you need to make sure that when you're working with a client, they need to know what they're working on and what you're working on. And he described it as a house. He was like, if you think of a house and you think of remodeling a house, there's all different rooms in the house. And you need to be able to articulate, we're in the kitchen now. And in the kitchen, we're just going to repaint. And now we're going to go into the bathroom, and we're going to do a full gut on the bathroom, new vanity, new sink, and new tub, whatever. And he was like, so you need to have a framework, one, to get repeatable results. So you do the same thing every time. And then two, to help articulate and show your clients where you're at in the process of working with them in their business. So that's what the book is. It's articulates my framework. And I mentioned it earlier, it's built off of the core 7. And those 7 parts are sales, product, cash, green coffee, roastery operations, people, and wholesale. And there's some other anecdotes as well inside of there, just around leadership, because again, a lot of the work that I do is around people management and people leadership. So there's some bits on that as well. But that's really what the framework is on. It's, if you're growing a roastery, what are the things you need to know? What are the things you need to think about as you're building a business that you don't have to wear every single hat forever in? And how do we create a structure that is sustainable, not from a green perspective, though that is important, but from a how do you survive perspective. So that's what the book is. It articulates my framework and outlines sort of how I approach working with clients and how a roaster might get to a healthy and stable place financially and in their business.
One thing that stuck out to me a lot when I was reading this is you talk a lot about roasters who sell coffee at a loss and just how common this is. And it seems like there's this very pervasive mindset that, I have to sell at a loss. I have to sort of get my foot in the door. Like there's these things that roasters are common mistakes that roasters are making, and they don't realize how much is holding them back. Where does this come from? And, what should we do about it?
I mean, you said it too with the form you asked the roasters and Roaster Link to fill out. 1 in 15 said they were in a healthy and comfortable spot financially. And so I don't need to be the person saying that a lot of the roasters I come across are not profitable. No, that's not all of them. There are some that are very, very stable and very healthy financially. And that just thrills me. That gets me pumped. And I'm excited when I come across roasters that are super healthy. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with the roaster, and I was asking that he it was sort of like an introductory call, and he was like, what am I not asking here? And I said, the thing that I would ask is, how's your cash position? As you head into next year and as you're thinking about rising green costs and rising costs across the board. And he kind of got a deer in the headlights look, because he purchased the business a few years ago, and deer in the headlights. And I was like, oh no, does he have zero? And so I didn't say anything. I just was quiet and we looked at each other through the screen. And I said, so what is your cash position? How many months of runway do you have? And he was like, maybe like 6 to 9. And I was like, that's amazing. And he just didn't know that was a really healthy place. So all that to say is, you can make money. That's the first thing I'll say. You deserve to make money. And there are roasters that are doing it. And I hope that encourages roasters that maybe are not making money to know that they can. Your question was, where does that mindset of, I have to sell it at a loss in order to gain market share, and then I'll just turn the switch on and eventually it'll be profitable? I think it comes from the sort of tech mindset of we need to burn for a long, long time, and then we'll get market share, and then we can switch the profit signal to on, and then it just becomes a profitable business overnight. I don't know that that's actually how it works. I look at profit more as kinetic energy. Things that are in motion stay in motion. Businesses that are profitable tend to continue to profit because of that mindset. And so I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, but I think it's related to tech. Then I also think it has something to do with, there's really amazing people in coffee that have the biggest hearts, that want to do amazing things in this world and want to not take or extract anything from the people around them to the extent that they aren't profitable and taking care of themselves. I think those two things are kind of where it comes from, but I'm not positive. That's where my intuition is, though.
Yeah, I tend to hear folks say things like, we love our community, we love coffee. And like you're saying, we don't want to extract, we want to add value. We want to be like support the community and like our, our city and it's, and we're going to sort of, put ourselves in a bad position financially to do that because, we don't want to charge our people too much kind of thing. And you've got to make money to stick around. So I think roasters should
have to.
They've got to make sure they're doing what they need to be able to serve like they want. If that's the driving motivation.
Yeah, it's tricky.
Well, let's see. You have an interesting history in wholesale and sales, and you talk a lot about that in the book. Can you give us a sense for what did that look like for you back in the day? And I'm curious, like what worked for you, and what do you see now that's different? Because I know things have changed quite a bit in the last 10 years in terms of how coffee is bought and sold, B2B. So what's changed after you tell us what your experience was like?
Yeah. So for me, the thing that I think is really interesting about coffee sales is that oftentimes, especially smaller or growing roasters, the tendency is to hire individuals that have no sales experience. And oftentimes it's their first sort of adult job even. And that was true for me, not from the adult job perspective, but I had never done sales before of any kind. And so the thing that worked for me was I just learned as much as I could about coffee and about sales. How do you have a sales conversation? What's the framework that you use in order to have a sales conversation? And so the thing that worked for me was to create a process and to iterate on that process. And this is what I talk about kind of in the book, is that's true of any department, is build a process. Then you can learn from, you know what? This step is not helpful. Or after the fifth step in the framework or the process, we lose the client. They just, or the prospect, they just lose interest. So what's happening there? And without having a process in place, I wouldn't have been able to isolate, we're losing them here. And we need to either send an email earlier or have another tasting or something like that. Without having your process mapped out and following it religiously with every single prospect and every single lead, it's very difficult to improve and to realize what's going to work for you. And so what worked for me is not going to work for everybody, outside of the fact that process and iterating on your process will be helpful because you will continue to be able to make your process better. So that's what I found. And I think at that time, one of the unique factors of the roasters that I was working for was we were heavily story driven. And we were heavily focused on buying the same coffees from the same producers every year, regardless of yield, regardless of price. And they knew that. The producers we were working with knew that as well. And that was a big selling point for us because our coffee was notably more expensive than our neighbors. My job was to articulate that. Yeah, it's going to be $4, a pound more expensive than the roaster up the street. To articulate that, and then to explain what does that mean for a producer. We're not making ourselves rich here. We are devoted to an equitable price, and this is what they have determined as an equitable price. And in order for us to be able to make money and to provide coffee, that's what it needs to be. So that was the unique thing for me at the time, was we were very story driven, and we were committed to sourcing coffee in a particular way. That won't work for everybody because that's not how every roaster sources coffee. And the last question was, what's changed? The market has completely changed. I go on Instagram and I look at cafes, and it's in some ways unrecognizable from 5 years ago. the drinks are very exciting and very interesting. It's not, latte with maybe a homemade syrup. There's some foam, there's some cold foam, there's you know, some other product that's going into it. There's, lemonade going into coffee, and there's all these different sort of additives that we're adding to it. And I'm not speaking negative or positive to any of those things, but that's changed. And so the buyers have changed a bit in terms of what they're interested in and what suits their needs. And I think that us as an industry have to start to kind of listen to some of those things that, man, your accounts aren't going to have a pour over bar. Maybe they will, but they probably won't. They're going to have maybe a blended drink option. They're going to have a matcha, heavily influenced matcha program. So those are the things that have kind of shifted from my perspective and that are different from when I was selling coffee to today. And I think it would be helpful for roasters to just be aware of that and to understand their buyers are different than they were a few years ago.
It is interesting. I talked to somebody who owns a chain of 3 locations, and they said that their business is growing quite a lot, but they're not ordering more coffee because it's the matcha that has made a huge difference in their sales volume. And they have some other things too. They've got some kind of like craft soda things that they're making, and there's some other things. But I think it is interesting that the cafe menu is, the dominance of coffee is still clear, but it's not like coffee's 99% of the menu anymore. Right. There's quite a few other things that can belong and do really well.
100%.
Let's see. You talk about it being really critical for a business leader or an owner to, I think the language you use is build the sales car before you hire somebody to drive it. What does that look like? Because, there's a lot of roastery owners out here who do not have sales experience. They've come from something else. Doing sales feels very unnatural. And I had a roaster tell me very directly, we're a product company, not a sales company. How do we grow our wholesale? And it's like,
oh, goodness.
You're going to have to become a sales company. You have to.
Yeah.
How does somebody become a sales company, and build a sales car if this is not something that they really have much experience with or know much about?
I'm going to say the same thing in some ways, that it's process related, meaning I understand that we maybe have some anxiety or some type of repulsion to doing sales or having sales as a part of our business or even marketing. But the reality is that those things are not slimy. They're slimy because you make them slimy. And I don't mean you, the listener. I mean that people who handle themselves inappropriately in those roles are the ones that make it slimy, not your roaster. It is entirely okay for you to have a sales wing and not to be creepy salesperson that y'all are thinking about. I was at a tap room last night, and somebody a rep had come in and was just being like very annoying, and that's not good sales. Good sales is when people want to interact with you and want what you have. But how do they do that? Well, they have to know that you exist. So this is connected to marketing. They have to know you exist, and they have to understand how they can buy your product. People don't buy what they don't see. If you have product for sale, but it's, imagine you go into a store, and imagine you're looking for a particular product, and the store has a product, but it's underneath the counter at an area you can't go into. You're probably not going to buy that product. Maybe you ask the counter attendant, but a lot of your buyers are not going to go through the effort to say, do you have this product? So for a company that's sort of pushing against that idea, we need to flip it onto its head and say, it's not about doing sales. It's about serving. It's about serving the buyers that want to work with you. And not everybody's going to want to, and that's okay. So when we talk about building the sales car, the thing that we're really talking about is, what does it mean for your roaster to serve your ideal buyers? So let's just do a thought experiment here. So let's say that you're in Ohio, middle of Ohio, small town of a couple 100,000 people, and your accounts are going to be, let's say, smaller cafes that do 25 pounds a week, let's say. What are the needs of an account that does 25 pounds a week? And as we just spoke about, maybe they do quite a bit of matcha. And so what are the needs that they might have versus an account that goes through 120 pounds a week? They're going to have different needs. And so when we start to think through, okay, who are the types of buyers that we want to serve? And then how do we build a sales program that can not just meet their needs, but sort of anticipate and create opportunities to give them the things that they need, such as maybe it is a matcha training. Maybe, and honestly, maybe it's heavily focused on milk steaming, because a lot of the drinks are going to have milk in them, and a lot of them are going to have, matcha drink's going to have milk in it probably too. And so maybe it's a little less, maybe your training program for your wholesale accounts is a little less focused on coffee and the terroir of this Ethiopian heirloom variety that you have that you're really excited about. Maybe it's a little less about that and a little more about, okay, what kind of service are you trying to provide to your customers when they come in to your cafes? So when we talk about building the sales car, we have to start with who are we serving? Who is the ideal buyer type? And then we can work backwards to figure out, okay, does this car need off-road tires or racing tires? Does this car need to be, a manual, or does this need to be an automatic vehicle? And so those are the types of things that I would start to think of as, who are we serving? We're not just throwing coffee at people. We're serving people. So what are those buyer types that we're trying to sell to? Where are they? What are their unique needs? And how do we build a sales program that speaks directly to them? And I know that this isn't probably earth-shattering. You've probably thought about this, but it's important for us to articulate it and to write it down. Writing it down and articulating, these are the types of buyers. This is the size we need them to be at. These are their needs. These are how we're anticipating. These are the ways that they grow, and this is how we can support that growth. Now we're starting to build a sales car, because we're starting to develop how we serve these clients. And then once we've done that, now we can start to talk about hiring a salesperson, because we built a sales car. We need somebody to drive that thing. And so all of that needs to happen well before we ever hire a salesperson. And the last thing I'll say is, and you had kind of mentioned this, is that a lot of times owners of roasters don't consider themselves salespeople. But I'm willing to bet you money that you, as an owner of a coffee roaster, have been in 100% more sales conversations than the person you're hiring to do sales, unless they have some wild experience. So you actually do know how to do sales. You do know how to handle objections. Whether you want to call it sales or not, you have been in those conversations. And so that experience should also inform how you're building that sales car and how you're mobilizing the person that's going to sit in that driver's seat.
You're saying a lot that resonates with me. I mean, growing up, I thought that marketing was manipulation. And, I worked in a cafe. I got burned out. People started hiring me to write articles on coffee things. And, so that's what I pursued. And even for a long time, I told myself, I am not doing content marketing. I am just doing coffee education.
Never say never.
And, I really had to come to terms that, that marketing was how I was going to help these businesses find their right customers, and everyone was going to be better for it. And it took even longer for me to realize the sales is the same way. I mean, I really resisted thinking of myself as a salesperson and like acknowledging that those skills are really important to have. And, I took over Fresh Cup a little over 3 years ago, and, sales is like one of my most critical things now. And I'm a
Hmm.
conflict avoider. I like strongly resisted sales. And, I feel quite comfortable now having sales conversations and
Yeah,
going through that process. And so I think there's a lot of people who might be listening to this who are going to say, this just is so unnatural to me. But I think
totally.
this is all overcomable and it's doable. The things that we tend to say to roasters, when they're looking at the Roaster League program, they're asking like, what does it look like to be successful? Generating wholesale leads and doing sales. The things that we tend to say are just have the discipline to track who you're talking to, indicate to yourself, did I call them? Did I text them? What did they say is important? Make some minimal notes at the very least. And even if that is just a spreadsheet that has like a status and some comments and basic information, as long as you have the discipline to look at that like at least once a week, just see where everybody is, call the people or email, whatever, communicate with the people you haven't talked to in a while, and you're going from 0 to 60 pretty quick if you can do those basic
Yeah,
things.
yeah. I want to just acknowledge something. One, this is why I love Fresh Cup so much, is the approach that I think that you're taking and have taken the company since you took over is how do we help and how do we serve, which is exactly what I was saying is what sales is. And I think RoasterLink does a really good job of that for your accounts. And the fact that you're willing to have those conversations with roasters and say, track these things. This is really important. That's the RoasterLink platform. Awesome. That is above and beyond, in my opinion, because you're providing them with feedback that they're probably not getting from really anywhere else unless they're talking to me or maybe somebody else like me. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you for doing that for the roasters in this space, because that is 0 to 60 just by tracking those things and having, even a minimal CRM.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, okay. Is there like one other kind of process or maybe a person that you want to call out as something that you've seen or a person you've seen that's been like, this person really inspired me, or like this particular process of a company I've worked with has been like, this really made an impact on, what I do and how I think what success can look like. I don't know, who or what would you want to call out?
I feel like I always mention the book Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time by JJ and I think Donald Sutherland, not the actor. Um, that book is, I even have a section in my book about that framework and that thinking. And it, when you synthesize it down, really the concept is iterative process optimization. Build a process, iterate on it, and do that in perpetuity. And so that's been really formative for me. And I should say one additional piece there is a lot of people push back on Scrum ideology and Agile ideology as well. And I think the pushbacks are totally fair. I think the mindset around continual improvement and getting rid of red tape is really important, very helpful. I think sometimes we create red tape for no reason. So that one is a formative book that I mention and make all of the owners that I work with go through. And then person that has inspired me, I just had them on the podcast not too long ago, Lucia Solis. It was interesting. So we realized that we do very, very similar work, but just on literally opposite ends of the supply circle. She's working with producers, trying to build repeatable, profitable processes for producers to produce coffee that yields them more sustainable and more thoughtful and livable wage. And then that's what I'm doing for roasters on this side of the supply circle. So it's been really inspiring to see someone doing very similar work in a completely different side of the industry. And the green side of the industry for me is my thesis has always been, if I can make roasters more profitable, they're going to spend more money on green coffee, which is hopefully working against the price crisis and trying to solve some of the folks that get pinched the most, which is producers. So those are my two my two books or two things that have been inspiring to me. So yeah.
I love that. This sort of like built-in resistance in this industry to making money. And gosh, I see this sometimes like we should all be making more money. The roasters, the green, the green producers, let's just all make some more money. And, that's really what the healthy industry is going to look like down the road.
Yes.
That's wonderful. Okay, so we've talked about Pomelo. We've talked about the book. There's something else that you do that I think is a part of this, your Junto group programs. Can you tell me what this looks like and, who's a good fit to join one of those?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what it is, Junto is an ongoing group, and I've shifted it. It used to be a 6-month program, and now it's an ongoing group where there's typically between 4 and 6 owners of coffee roasters from around the country who go through a program with me. And so there's some reading, there's some writing, there's some things to watch and to listen to throughout the process. And it's very, very cool. Some of the outcomes have been pretty significant. And the thing that I thought it would be helpful for the roasters, of course, but seeing roasters support one another from there was a roaster in Atlanta that was in a group with a roaster in Montana, and they shared a resource that saved them like $170,000 a year. And just from one conversation, and it's just really cool to see the coffee community owners supporting each other in an environment where we're not fighting each other. We're not going for the same accounts. We're here to support each other, to believe in each other, and to encourage each other, and also give pushback where needed and where necessary. There's been the current one. There's been some challenges with some personnel for one of the companies, and so the other owners have kind of rallied around them and given them resources and some feedback on those things. So that's sort of the structure. Is every month we read something. There's some writing. There's some learning opportunities, and then there's also a hot seat. It's sort of like a mastermind type hot seat where you present on either a project you're working on, something like a challenge you're facing, or something you're just thinking about. Maybe I'm thinking about changing my business in this way. How would you all approach this? And so they present for about 20 minutes, and then we give some feedback and some pushback on whatever it is they're presenting. And then there's also an online community where they're able to communicate back and forth with each other and share helpful links and things that they've used. And then you ask for what is the right fit for something like this. Well, there's actually 2 of them. So one is for owners exclusively, and typically you need to be doing about $500,000 worth of business. Most of the owners are doing north of 2 million to anywhere around 6 to 7 million a year in top line revenue. But there's another Junto group, and this one's more for leaders that work for coffee roasters. And so if you're doing less than $500,000, that's probably a better group for you to be in. And that group is focused on resourcing emerging leaders in roasters. Because for me, I didn't really I had to go find resources and find books and figure out, how do I develop myself? Because there isn't a clear pathway for young people coming up in this industry to learn what are the next steps for me. Or maybe I don't really want to be in this industry. How do I learn and upskill in order for me to get into maybe another job or something of that nature? So those are kind of some of the things we do in the leader group, but it's structured very similarly to the ownership group as well.
Very cool. What else? Working on anything else exciting these days?
I'm always working on little things. The book is about to be released in beginning of December. They're supposed to land here in like 2 weeks, and so we'll do an official launch for that. So I'm prepping for the official launch, and then I'm working on a few new lines of business. Something interesting that's been coming up for me is doing some organizational structure for some roasters, helping them determine how to build in the right people in the right places so they can grow to the next stage. And then the last thing that I'm kind of working on a new line of business is we've been working with owners that are seeking to sell or buy coffee roasters. And so I've been navigating, supporting owners on both sides of those conversations and facilitating some of those conversations and helping them think through, how do we prepare to sell or how do we prepare to purchase a roaster? So those are kind of the two big things that I'm working on right now. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm excited to hear how this buying and selling support service goes for you, because yeah, there's a lot happening there. I know this from my own experience in buying a business. There's almost no rules. You really just make it up as you go, and there's like infinite number of possibilities, it seems like. So it's always really interesting to see what people come up with. How they make a deal, how they evaluate potential, and things like that. Okay, maybe we'll have to have another podcast about that.
Sure.
All right. Here's what I'm going to say. Often you can listen to a podcast and you can be like, all right, I'm not going to buy the book. I've heard the core tenets. I think I've got it. I'm going to save like $15 and 10 hours of my time. That is not the case with your book. Your book's very good. And there's so much we did not talk about that's featured in there. That's some really practical information. So highly recommend listeners to go check that out. Where can people go find about you, find about the book, and get in touch with you if they've got questions?
Well, first of all, that's really, really kind. Thank you so much. Folks can find the book on my website. It is just pomelocoffeeconsulting.com. And there's a little tab at the top that says book. Click there and you'll be in the right place. If you want to set up like a wholesale account, you just reach out to me on my contact tab on my contact page on my website as well. Again, pomelocoffeeconsulting.com. And that should be all you need. Be in the zone.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming, Luke. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Garrett. This was just a delight. It's always a treat to talk to you, and I'm always enjoy our conversations and really appreciate the work you're doing with Fresh Cup and with Roasterlink and with the podcast. And so thank you for having me and hosting thoughtful conversations. I really do enjoy the podcast. Thanks so much.